As a result of the conflict in the Middle East, we are confronted with a flood of information via social networks. Supporters of the different parties to the conflict are trying to control the public agenda through messages, images, and thus support their version of the truth and their point of view. But how can outsiders be sure of the authenticity of images or videos? And who should be trusted regarding correct casualty figures, motives of the war parties, the feasibility of alternative courses of action? Anyone who allows these questions to be asked and does not from the outset listen to only one source quickly finds himself in a situation of gnawing uncertainty. In such cases, which can arise with respect to all aspects of life, we depend on authorities we can trust, especially when it comes to existential problems such as war and peace. In the end, no society can function without trust. Individuals cannot become experts in all relevant matters. In some areas, they cannot but resort to the knowledge of others. Trusting others in this way, however, is not unproblematic. In a Platonic dialogue, an interlocutor of Socrates called Menon already raised the central problem, arguing that it is futile to look for what we don't know, since we won't know when we have found it. In other, slightly less paradoxical words, we can never trust the knowledge of another person because ultimately we cannot know whether they know what we are ignorant of. Slightly less paradoxical. Is this paradox, which modern, complex and plural societies are clearly struggling with, resolvable? Asked differently, how can we prevent the spread of mistrust in our societies, and how are we to avoid placing our trust in false authorities? Hello and welcome to the second episode of ConTrust, the podcast on trust in conflict. My name is Thomas Biebricher. I'm a professor of political science at Goethe University Frankfurt and a principal investigator at ConTrust. And once again in this podcast, we want to reflect on big issues of our time and society, as every time together with a researcher from the ConTrust Research Initiative, an institution of the Goethe University Frankfurt based at the Research Center Normative Orders and the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt. If you would like to know more about the background of this podcast, please listen to the first episode. But today, we'll get right into it with our guest. I'm extremely pleased to have Regina Schidel sitting right in front of me. It's great to have you here to talk with you about the questions I've just outlined.
Hi.
Regina Schidel is a philosopher and works as a postdoc in the research initiative ConTrust on epistemic exclusions and marginalized knowledge. In 2022, she received her PhD in philosophy from Goethe University Frankfurt with a thesis on relationality of human dignity, on the justice theoretical status of people with intellectual disabilities. She was a member and research assistant in the Leibniz research group Transnational Justice under the direction of Professor Rainer Forst. Since 2020, she has been part of the Research Center Normative Orders and the research initiative ConTrust, with a special interest in political philosophy, practical philosophy, and social philosophy. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Regina. Let's get right into it. From what we learned in our first episode, you deal with one of many conceptions of trust, applying the core concept to a specific context, or rather a specific form of knowledge, that is epistemic trust, which, as we will learn, isn't a narrowly defined epistemic question. In which sense, then, is knowledge a question of trust?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas, for this nice introduction, and thanks for having me here in the ConTrust podcast series. In which sense is knowledge a question of trust? I think this has to do with the social nature of knowledge. In acquiring knowledge, we are always dependent on others, as we cannot check all the knowledge of others personally. We must trust them and their knowledge in a way. This is a central insight of social epistemology, that knowledge is hardly ever acquired solely from an isolated perspective of the individual, but that it is, even in the case of hard scientific knowledge, positioned and moreover dependent on the involvement of a multitude of actors. This gets clear if we imagine how scientific knowledge production takes place, for example, in a biological laboratory. There is a multiplicity of actors involved, all with their own specializations. Each single scientist cannot verify whether all his or her colleagues really adhere to the standards or norms of research, but they have to trust each other in creating scientific knowledge. This is, so to say, the simple definition of epistemic trust. It is the dimension of trust that has to do with our coming to believe through reliance on other people's testimony, as Gloria Oricci formulates it. But then it gets a bit complicated, because when we ask whether trusting the knowledge of others is justified or whether it is rather blind, knowledge comes in again. And here, in this second sense, knowledge does not just play the role of an object of trust, but it is itself a basis of trust, because some knowledge is already required in order to be able to trust a person or institution in a justified manner. When we now look at cases of epistemic trust, they involve trust in experts and their expertise. Just think about trust or mistrust in virologists during the COVID pandemic. But epistemic trust is not limited to expert knowledge, but also exists in more everyday cases involving the credibility of other persons. For example, testimony in court or the report of a victim of violent crimes. And now my claim is that the question how those testimonies or persons are trusted is not a purely rational question, so to say, but it is also a question of social power, of the social identities of the persons involved, and of associated asymmetrical hierarchies in a society.
So let's continue with this. So that knowledge is a question of power, and therefore injustice is an insight that Miranda Fricker laid out in her concepts of hermeneutical injustice and testimonial injustice, which I think you already alluded to. Let me elaborate a little bit on this for our listeners. So with these notions, she started a debate connecting epistemological questions with moral ones, and she explains that idea of hermeneutical justice by referring to the second women's movement, where women invented the term of sexual harassment to describe a shared experience they didn't have a word for yet, which included this experience and its harmful as well as shared character. So this was a precondition of scandalizing sexual harassment. By now, the term is widely recognized. However, particularly the Me Too movement has also showed that despite this hermeneutic resource, the practice is not only still common, but also that the questioning of testimonies thereof go along with it. So this makes an example of testimonial justice, if that is correct. Does that summarize the concepts then? And what do these concepts help us understand in your point of view then?
Yes, this description summarizes the ideas of epistemic injustice quite well, as Fricker described them. And indeed, it was a very important contribution by Fricker to show that questions of justice and injustice concern not only the distribution of material goods or the justification of political power, but also knowledge positions and their social circumstances. Fricker shows in her book that participation in the game of being a reliable knowledge partner is already shaped by social exclusions, like sexism or racism, and social power relations in a society. Epistemic injustices, as Fricker describes them, denote a wrong done to someone specifically in their capacity as a knower. And her analysis of epistemic disadvantage as a distinct form of injustice responds not only to a missing element in debates about justice in political philosophy, but also, as you said, to the failure to address questions of injustice in epistemology. And this connection of epistemic questions with more political ones about justice is exactly what makes your concept of epistemic injustice interesting. It helps us to understand that justice does not only have a material and political dimension, but also one associated to persons as knowers and epistemic subjects. That means being not recognized or being not trusted as a reliable knower due to one's religious, cultural, or gendered identity constitutes a wrong in its own right that cannot just be reduced to other forms of wronging. And this does, of course, not exclude the possibility that all forms of injustice might have an epistemic component. But in case of the so-called epistemic injustices, the epistemic dimension is the primary one.
So can I ask you about this? So if I translate that correctly, and hopefully I am, so this is very much about the problem of some people not being accepted as trustworthy judges or, givers of testimonials, right, about their own situation. Does a critical position on that not presuppose some kind of undistorted view of society? I mean, that's a typical argument against these kinds of theories. How can you respond to that?
Yes, I think so. And that gets also already clear in the title of this whole debate following Fricker's book, Epistemic Injustice. So, and this presupposes that injustices can just be analyzed and described as such if we presuppose a just version of society. This is, in some sort already the normative horizon against which the diagnosis of injustices or the wrongs or something like that is outlined. Yeah, that's I think a presupposition of this entire debate.
Mm-hmm. In your work, you also rely on another person, Jose Medina. What does he add to the perspective that Miranda Fricker brings to the table here in regards to all of these questions?
Yeah, so sometimes Fricker, she comes from analytical moral philosophy, from this Anglophone tradition.
Oh, which we love, of course.
Of course. Who does not here in Frankfurt? Yes, and Fricker, coming from this tradition, she seems to presuppose that epistemic injustices can be solved by virtuous single agents. And this means that if all people were aware that they might be biased in their trust towards other agents depending on social identities, and if they just try to counter those biases, the problem of epistemic injustices would be solved, so to say. And this picture is, of course, a bit too simplistic. But all in all, Fricker in her book is quite optimistic about the virtuous capacities of individual agents. And now Jose Medina, he is more skeptical in this regard. And he thinks that historical and political power structures have a deeper effect on single agents than we might be aware of. And in this sense, he could be read as a critical theorist more in the Frankfurt tradition. For example, Medina says that testimonial injustices do not only take the form of credibility deficits, but that there are also credibility excesses toward members of socially dominant groups, which then in turn influence the comparative epistemic status of the underprivileged. And another important element that he adds to Fricker's analysis is that virtuous behavior might not always be the best solution to overcome structural injustices, but sometimes other forms of action could be helpful, which he calls epistemic resistances. An example for this could be that it cannot always be the task of underprivileged groups to explain their oppression to the privileged ones. For example, Black people explaining structural racism and its way of working in order to overcome hermeneutical lacks. But in those cases, Medina states the epistemic burden in gaining hermeneutical knowledge should be alive with the whites, and persons of color should rightfully resist to be only in the role of an informant. And what is also interesting about Medina's approach is the role he attributes to social imaginaries. That is to say, the epistemic resources of a society that structure what is imaginable in a society at all. Those imaginary constellations have a deep influence on questions of trust because they, in a sort, predefine what counts as trustworthy and what does not. And now the critical impetus, in a way, is to to change those social imaginaries.
Mm-hmm. So, whereas Fricker is still debating the question on a more interpersonal level, what Medina brings to the table is really the sort of structural, systemic aspect to it. And also, of course, that question of resistance in comparison or in contrast to virtuous behavior, as you say, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So now you have these two ingredients and these very important and these days very influential debates as well. Now you take them and try to apply them to your research on trust. How do you do that? How do you import that? And what's the effect then?
So I think the debates about epistemic justice and injustice are helpful in thinking about trust from a philosophical perspective, since in many philosophical debates on trust, the analysis tends to be too rationalistic. Many scholars are mainly devoted to the question, what makes agents trustworthy in purely individualistic terms? That comes also from the analytical debate. And they tend to forget that trust in the testimony of others never takes place in a vacuum, but is already embedded in a historically, culturally, socially, and politically preformed context, and also deeply influenced by that context, by that specific society. And there's also an important role that affects and emotions play for questions of trust. And this social psychological dimension also gets clearer when we consider more critical approaches like that of Medina, for example. Now, research on epistemic injustice didn't ignore questions of trust completely. There are some scholars dealing with it, but I think it isn't still sufficient. And all in all, it seems to be important to me to avoid rationalistic and individualistic shortcomings when thinking about epistemic trust, and to put a stronger focus on the role of emotions on the one hand and social asymmetries and power relations on the other hand. Yeah.
So in our first episode, we talked about, Anna Forst and I, we talked about the normative status of trust. So my question to you is, I mean, from what it sounds like, from what you've been saying so far, I would think that you would answer that trust is a normatively desirable thing. Is that right? And at the same time, you know, I mean, there's so many things we could problematize about who trusts whom and for what reason and so on and so forth. So how would you describe your take on that question?
So this is a question about the normativity of trust.
We love normativity, just as we like, you know, the analytical philosophy.
Yeah, we're sitting here in the building normative orders, right? So I would say that trust isn't a good or bad thing per se, but rather that we cannot live without trust, as it reduces the enormous complexity of our life, right? As Luhmann said. And trust can be a good thing. It can help in fostering solidarity in a society, for example, but it can also be a bad thing, like trust in populist leaders or trust in deniers of climate change and so on. And I think what is more interesting is to ask under which conditions trust can be fruitful or rational, and when a good amount of mistrust can also be helpful, for example, in democracies where it is absolutely necessary that people mistrust the government to a certain degree. But there might be also a point where such productive mistrust turns into total and irrational distrust, and that are the questions we should look at more closely from a philosophical perspective.
And do you have some examples for that?
For example, the Querdenker, right?
There's no translation for that term as far as I know. Yes,
so
please, go
should
on.
I elaborate
yes,
on
please
this?
Do. Please do.
So the Querdenker, or maybe a translation would be the lateral thinkers.
I thought the queer thinkers.
The queer thinkers. They were, or they are sort of a populist movement, especially in Germany during the COVID pandemic. And they deeply distrusted medical expertise about COVID. They were skeptical about vaccination and considered politics during the pandemic as a fundamental constraint of liberty rights. And what is interesting about them is their success in bringing together bringing together people from the political right and the political left, or at least some of them. And what is more, the Querdenkers' trust in their own positioning and group is essentially based on demarcations from others, from other groups. So all in all, the Querdenkers' common belief is not simply that the coronavirus does not exist. Instead, their belief consists of a complex web of opinions about the publicly misjudged dangerousness of the virus, the supposed establishment of a health dictatorship, or an improper exercise of power by medical experts. And thus the intent seems not to be just denying the existence of the coronavirus, but rather to establish a political alliance directed against the elites, those up there, or a scientific system perceived as elitist. And their point is to strengthen trust internally toward similarly thinking people and members of one's own group, and to express distrust externally, that means toward the others. And to this behavior of demarcation, there adds like a skepsis of plurality, because the Querdenker, they operate strategically via demarcation from other social movements like Black Lives Matter, and beyond their negative engagement against others, they do not themselves pursue any articulated goal of their own. Yeah, they just have like negative goals in gaining the trust of their members. Maybe the only positive claim is a rhetoric insistence on liberty rights. But I think they are a great example how playing with trust or distrust can foster a community's own coherence in creating a strong border towards others.
Now, from this specific example, I think you've already alluded to some of the aspects that I'm interested in next, and that is the question of the role that epistemic trust plays in democratic processes, and what role it plays maybe as a resource, maybe, but also maybe as epidemic mistrust or distrust in a liberal democratic context. We talked about some aspects of the relation of trust to liberal democracy in the first episode with Rainer Forst. I'm wondering about your take on this.
So I think what is important for democracies is to think of trust as a process, or to think of its processual character. This point is also made strong by Martin Hartmann's analysis, and he says that the act or attitude of trusting itself changes the reasons we have for trusting. That is to say, through trust and a commitment associated with it, something new comes into the world that also influences the trustees and their reasons, their behavior. And I think this is exactly the point that is interesting for political processes and a critical understanding of epistemic trust. So if we give someone a leap of faith, ein Vertrauensvorschuss, we would say in German, this can motivate the person or gives him reasons to act in a way he or she wouldn't have without the trusting relation. And this is also interesting for a wider context of society, because breaking up epistemic injustices or epistemic distrust towards marginalized groups does not only mean a gain in knowledge or epistemic resources, but it also means fostering processes of democratic inclusion. Think, for example, of Charles Mill's example of white ignorance. It is the ignorance of a privileged white class of society towards experiences that people of color face day after day. And this example is mainly from the United States, but I think we can also transfer it to other contexts. And now in breaking up such white ignorance through epistemic frictions, like Medina calls them, trust relations can be built, and those trust relations in turn enhance epistemic exchange. And here, I think questions of trust and knowledge are deeply intertwined in its potential for democratically inclusive processes. And that's the role that epistemic trust can play in democratic societies in a productive and inclusive manner.
Mm-hmm. Well, if I understood you correctly, and you're referring to epistemic frictions, is that the word that you used? And I think that points in the direction of the next question that I have to ask you, of course, since we're talking about ConTrust, and it's about trust and conflict. And so the question, of course, is what role does conflict play in your engagement with these issues of epistemic trust and distrust? I mean, is the concept of an epistemic friction, for example, is that something that would be along these lines then?
Yes, it would be. So I think conflict is indispensable in order to break up epistemic injustices, or something like white ignorance, right? The Charles Mill's example. Because without social movements like Black Lives Matter, who struggle against their exclusion both in political and material, but also in epistemic terms, old and traditional hierarchies would never change. And as our ConTrust project states, such conflicts can be productive. And in my example, they can be productive if formerly oppressed and underprivileged groups claim their authority also in an epistemic sense and redefine cultural patterns of trustworthiness. And then, like you explained, such conflicts can lead to epistemic frictions in Medina's sense and thereby change trust relations within a society. However, and I think that is important, epistemic conflicts are not conducive to trust if they operate exclusively through the unjustified devaluation and exclusion of others. And if there is no struggle about one's own substantive concerns, but instead the focus is exclusively on discrediting others. So if conflicts lead to trust, whether they lead to like inclusive relations of trust, or rather to the perpetuation of old forms of oppression, that depends on the concrete case, and we have to analyze them more closely.
And would you have maybe a positive example for us where that worked out as what you sketched?
I think the Black Lives Matter could be such a positive example. Also, it's like migration from the US to other countries, like in Europe, to really get knowledge about the exclusions, the marginalizations, all those little experiences Black people face every day, the majority doesn't really know about. And I think this movement, this claim, this upheaval, listen to us, listen to our experiences, that really changed something. And I think it also fostered trust relations in a post-migrant society, like in Germany, in a way. Yeah.
Regina, I want to ask you a final question. As you know, we live in post-factual times, at least that's often alleged. Frieder Vogelmann, a former associate in Frankfurt, writes that the so-called post-factual age isn't actually about a decline of facts and truth in the realm of politics, but about the strategic use of falsehoods. And so the question is, what is the role of truth or facts in questions of epistemic trust and epistemic injustice then? I mean, these are, of course, big questions, but maybe you have an answer to it.
So Vogelmann's claim is that there exists like a political play with the obviously false, like in the case of Trump, who fosters loyalties within his own political movement through consciously playing with the false, and this is obvious. That's not post-factual. It's
playing
play.
With the false the same as lying?
Maybe sort of, yeah. But I think more than lying, it's an instrumentalization of facts, of truth for political purposes. And I think that in the case of epistemic injustices that we have discussed, it is quite different. Because, for example, testimonial injustices take place just based on identity prejudices. They have nothing to do with the quality of knowledge that is articulated, and they persist. Also, the relevant testimony might be absolutely true, fact-based, evident, and so on. So that's the difference. But what is similar to the Trump case is that the force of the facts or the truth is overridden by other forces like prejudice, political calculus, or ignorance. So maybe one could say that in the case of epistemic trust, it is interesting to find out how its epistemic dimension, the epistemic dimension, not the trust dimension, can be fostered, and when it is trumped by other forces like emotions, strategic motives, resentment, fear of change, and so on.
I mean, that's one more thing we could talk about, the effective dimension of all of this that you just, I think, alluded to. But we've come to the end of our episode, and we thank you very much. We could have gone on much longer in these very, very stimulating discussions. Regina, for all you interested listeners, we are placing the links to publications by Regina Schidel in the show notes again. You're also invited to have a look at the ConTrust website, where you will find this podcast, but also publications, videos, events, and background information on our research. This was the second episode of ConTrust, the podcast on trust and conflict. I would like to thank Regina Schidel for these exciting insights that she shared with us, and I look forward to the next episode, hopefully with you again. Until then, bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Thomas. That was great and inspiring.